So let's talk about hormonal homeostasis. Here's our syllabus objectives. We need to describe how hormones relay messages to cells, displaying specific receptors via the circulatory or lymphatic system. And we need to also explain how receptor binding alters cellular activity, and that the cell sensitivity is directly related to the number of receptors. So let's get into it. Firstly, it's worth just making a comparison between the hormonal and neural messenger. Firstly, it's just worth making comparison between hormonal versus neural messengers used for homeostasis. So, in terms of the mode of transmission, in the neural system, the signal is largely electrical. Of course, it's chemical across the synapses. It's electrical through the neurons and through the nervous system. The hormonal system, hormones are chemicals, and they are spread through the circulatory system and also the lymphatic system, which I'll explain. In terms of speed, the neural signals are very rapid, whereas hormonal signals, because they have to travel through the blood vessels, they're much slower. The neural system is very specific. You can move just the muscles of your little finger, whereas hormonal tends to be more widespread because the hormones flush through the whole circulatory or lymphatic system. And in terms of the nerve signal, it's very short in duration. Once it's sent, that's the end of it, whereas the hormonal tends to have a longer duration of effect. So this time we're talking about the hormonal system. Hormones are produced in secreting cells. They're in glands like the pancreas or the adrenal glands or the pituitary gland, and they have cells called secreting cells that produce and secrete the hormones. They then travel through the circulatory or lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is also another type of vessel system, and it moves around the extracellular fluid in the body. And so hormones are able to travel through the circulatory or the lymphatic system, and they travel to target cells. Whilst they come in contact with all cells, they'll only have an effect on target cells. And target cells are those that have a receptor, a specific receptor on the surface of the cell to detect that particular hormone. So we have secreting cells travel through the circulatory and lymphatic system to target cells that have a receptor for that particular hormone. If there's no receptors, then it's not a target cell, and the hormone has no effect on those cells. So we have our secreting cells in our gland that release the hormones into the blood or the lymphatic system. It travels through to cells all around the body, and when it's received by target cells, then it has a function. It's worth just noting, this is not in the syllabus, but it's important to understand, because when we're talking about different types of homeostasis, like osmoregulation and thermoregulation, these terms come up, like the hypothalamus. This is part of the brain, and it is largely the control center for many of these functions, and it has receptors for water in the blood. It has receptors for temperature, etc. And it has a section that's very, very close to it, which is actually part of the endocrine system called the pituitary gland, which is just below it. And we call this one the master gland because it actually sends hormonal signals to other glands in the endocrine system. So one of the things we need to talk about is how receptor binding, so binding of the hormone with the receptor, alters cellular activity. Thinking about that signal transduction that we talked about with neural homeostasis. And then we need to talk about the sensitivity as well. So receptor binding alters cellular activity. We have our hormones that bind with the receptors like a lock and a key. So they're very specific on the surface of the target cell. And we have a transduction pathway where we have a number of intermediate steps where that signal is changed. So we have a signal transduction, and ultimately we have a cellular response. Now that response can vary in terms of, it could be about opening or closing channels, activating enzymes, excreting something. It really varies. But we've got this hormone that binds with the surface. We have a pathway of signal transduction, and then we have a response. The second part here we need to talk about is this cell sensitivity to a specific hormone is directly related to the number of receptors. And so it makes sense here that if you have more receptors, it's more sensitive, and less receptors, less sensitive. Now, what's really cool here is that organisms are able to change the sensitivity by increasing or decreasing the number of receptors. So we call it upregulation when we increase the number of receptors and it becomes more sensitive. And an example of that is the oxytocin receptors in the uterine muscles that occurs before labor, because oxytocin causes contraction of the uterine muscles to start pushing the baby out. And so if there's more oxytocin receptors, then you have stronger contractions. Now, downregulation is when there's a decrease in the number of receptors, so it becomes less sensitive to that hormone. And an example of that occurs when in the situation of insulin resistance. So when people have chronically high glucose levels in the blood, well, there can be a downregulation of the glucose receptors, or the insulin receptors, I should say, of the muscles and the liver.